She thought he was just a lone drifter cowboy, but he owned half the state and hadn't loved in years. What he did after she said thank you changed everything. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Grace Callahan pedaled along the dusty stretch that meandered through the outskirts of Cedar Hills, a small town in southwestern Colorado. Late afternoon sun poured across the rolling plains, creating a golden haze. She shifted gears as the gravel crunched under her bicycle tires, trying to keep her balance on the uneven surface. It was a familiar route, her routine path home from the library where she worked, but today she felt a tingling sense of restlessness. At 36, Grace often wondered if her life had somehow stalled. She found solace in books, but lately she longed for something beyond the quiet pages and the echoing hush of the library walls. Not far ahead, she spotted a battered pickup truck hurtling in her direction, kicking up clouds of dust. Alarm flickered in her eyes. She steered carefully to the right, determined to avoid trouble. The driver, clearly in a hurry, swerved slightly across the middle of the road. Grace jerked her handlebars, panicking for a split second. Her front wheels skidded on loose gravel, the world tilting sideways. Before she could regain control, she went down in a thud of metal and dust. Pain flashed through her left knee as she hit the ground. Her pulse raced as she tried to catch her breath, the pickup truck rumbling away in the distance, oblivious to what had happened behind it. Disoriented and coated in dirt, Grace managed to push herself upright, wincing at the scrape on her leg. Amid the swirl of dust, a silhouette emerged. It was a man astride a chestnut horse, broad-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. He dismounted smoothly, revealing a tall frame, shoulders broad under a simple denim shirt. He moved with a calm certainty, leading his horse by the reins. In a single fluid motion, he extended a hand toward her. "You okay, miss?" he asked in a low voice, polite but subdued. Grace blinked, surprised to see a stranger on horseback. Tourists occasionally rode the nearby trails, but this man looked more like a drifter than a casual visitor. She accepted his hand and let him pull her to her feet. For a moment, she noticed the kindness in his dark eyes and the gentle tilt of his mouth. A faint smile graced his lips, but it didn't quite reach all the way, as if weighted by unspoken thoughts. "Thank you," she managed, brushing dust off her jeans. Her knee stung, but she tried to appear composed. "I'm fine, I think. That truck came out of nowhere." He nodded. "Let me help you with your bike." In silence, he lifted the bicycle upright, checking for obvious damage. Grace felt her heart steadying. The air smelled of sagebrush and warm earth, the late sunlight glinting on the stranger's silver belt buckle. She opened her mouth to say something, perhaps ask his name or how he happened to be there, when he broke the quiet first. "I'm Will." His voice was measured and calm, as though he weighed each word. "Grace," she replied, still blinking away the dust. "Grace Callahan." He looked over her injury. "Your knee's bleeding. Maybe you should get that cleaned up." Grace gestured toward the town just a short ride ahead. "I live nearby," she explained. "I'll take care of it at home, but I appreciate your help, I really do." Will only nodded again. He offered a courteous smile before pulling gently on the reins to mount his horse. In a moment, he was back in the saddle, the horse stamping against the gravel. She noticed the quiet strength in his posture, a self-assuredness that felt oddly comforting. Without a further word, he tipped his hat and turned toward the horizon, the fading sun at his back. Dust rose in small clouds around the horse's hooves as he departed. Grace watched him go, her breath still uneven from the fall and from the strange sense of possibility that lingered in the wake of his visit. When she finally coaxed her bicycle forward, Her thoughts buzzed with questions. The pain in her knee was real, yet her mind swirled with a different ache, a realization that this unexpected meeting had stirred something deep inside her. Grace pedaled on, her heart beating in sync with the rhythm of distant hoofbeats, wondering if she'd ever see that lone cowboy again. The next morning, Grace limped into the library, her bandaged knee a reminder of the incident on the dusty road. The building, a modest one-story structure with peeling paint and creaking floorboards, sat at the heart of Cedar Hills. It was far from grand, but it served as a lifeline for the town's residents who craved knowledge, or simply a peaceful space to read. Grace inhaled the familiar scent of old books and wooden shelves, feeling both comforted and slightly restless. Despite the bruise on her knee, her mind kept drifting back to the mysterious cowboy who called himself Will. "I heard you took a tumble," Linda Harper teased gently from behind the main desk. A warm-hearted woman in her early 40s, Linda had bright eyes that seemed to dance whenever she spoke. "Some folks said they saw a cowboy come riding to your rescue." Grace placed her purse down with care, wincing as she bent her knee. "So you already know half the story," she said with a small laugh. "That truck nearly sent me off the road. If it hadn't been for him, I might still be lying in the dust." Linda handed Grace a cup of coffee, taking a moment to study her friend's face. "But you don't exactly look upset," she observed, a playful grin forming. "Who was he?" Grace took a sip, shaking her head. "He said his name was Will, that's pretty much it. Quiet fellow. Helped me up, checked my bike, and left." It was hard for Grace to shrug off the memory of his reserved kindness and the way his gaze seemed distant, yet oddly gentle. She busied herself by reshelving a small stack of books, mostly classics by Steinbeck, Hemingway, and Fitzgerald, and tried not to dwell on the flicker of interest sparking deep inside her. But the library felt different today, charged with possibility. Before noon, Linda's voice floated through the stacks. "Grace, we got our monthly budget report. Let's just say it's not encouraging." Grace sighed. The Cedar Hills Library had been struggling financially for years. Limited county funds barely covered the utilities, leaving her to shuffle book purchases, building repairs, and community outreach programs. Lately, she had grown worried that the library might eventually close, an unsettling prospect for a town that had few other cultural resources. She made her way to the front desk, scanning the bleak numbers. "We might have to cut back on hours," she muttered, the pinch of dread tightening her chest, "or figure out a fundraising idea." She paused, glancing around at the dusty shelves. "This place is important, Linda. We can't let it go under." Linda nodded, a hint of determination on her face. "We'll figure something out. Maybe hold a local event to raise money, or ask for donations from surrounding areas. People around here care, they just need a nudge." Trying to focus on her duties, Grace organized a display of classic American novels, including Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men and The Grapes of Wrath. She wondered if the stranger who'd helped her had a special fondness for Steinbeck. Perhaps he simply liked the frontier spirit those stories evoked. Thoughts of him hovered in her mind as she made neat stacks. Around midday, a group of teenagers trooped in for a study session, and Grace guided them toward the reference section, practicing her usual friendly composure. However, every so often, an unguarded moment set her mind drifting back to that fleeting encounter on the road. Who was Will? Why had he seemed so solemn beneath that courteous exterior? Later, while straightening a precarious tower of old periodicals, Grace accidentally knocked a few volumes over. As she stooped to pick them up, her eye caught a vintage Steinbeck edition she hadn't noticed in ages, East of Eden. The worn cover felt like a sign, and she couldn't help but picture Will scanning the pages, silent and thoughtful. Despite her attempts to focus on the library's troubles, she couldn't shake the subtle excitement brewing inside her. A single afternoon had introduced a spark of possibility into her life. She just didn't know yet where it might lead, or whether she dared follow that sudden flicker of hope. By midweek, Grace had nearly convinced herself that her mysterious rescuer was already long gone from Cedar Hills. Yet, as she arrived at the library early that morning, her heart skipped a beat. Standing by the history and geography section was a familiar tall figure in a wide-brimmed hat. Will turned slowly, as though sensing her presence, and met her eyes with a slight nod. A wave of unexpected relief washed over Grace at the sight of him. He offered a polite smile. "Morning." "Hello," she replied, placing her handbag behind the counter. Nerves fluttered in her stomach, but she willed herself to stay calm. "You need help finding anything?" He looked down at the worn copy of John Steinbeck's The Red Pony in his hands. "I'd like to check out some more Steinbeck, and maybe some detailed maps of the region." Grace's curiosity sparked. "The county archives might have old survey maps if that's what you're after. They're in the back, near the local history files." She paused. "I can show you." Will followed her to a tall wooden filing cabinet where they kept old records, scans of antique plats, and topographical charts. He studied them intently, his brow creased in concentration. Meanwhile, Grace quietly observed the subtle lines of wear on his boots, the sun-bleached edge of his hat, and the calloused hands that handled each paper gently. He seemed both rugged and reserved, as if carrying a quiet heaviness beneath his polite demeanor. After several minutes, she couldn't hold back her curiosity. "Are you planning on traveling around the state?" Will slid one of the maps back into its protective sleeve. "Something like that," he said softly. "I've been looking for places to settle, or maybe just places to clear my head." His voice sounded guarded, as though he wasn't used to sharing details of his life. Grace let the silence settle, a thoughtful hush in the dusty air. She sensed that prying wouldn't get her far. Instead, she gestured to a stack of agricultural surveys. "We also have more modern data if you need specifics on ranching conditions or water sources in the area." He nodded in thanks, then quietly added, "I appreciate your help." Grace's mind flickered back to that moment he'd reached out to steady her after her fall. She almost asked about his plans, where he came from, why he seemed so private, but caution held her tongue. Instead, she told him he was welcome to stay as long as he liked, even if he just needed a quiet spot to read. For a while, he stood near one of the tall windows, flipping through pages with an air of subdued concentration. Grace returned to her duties at the circulation desk, resisting the urge to stare. Occasionally, she glanced his way. Several patrons passed by, casting curious looks at the newcomer, but no one approached him. Will exuded a certain invisible boundary that kept idle chatter at bay. As noon approached, he returned the maps to Grace. "Thank you," he repeated. "You've been very kind." Then, much like his first departure, he simply tipped his hat and slipped out the door. She watched him leave, the jingle of the library's entrance bell echoing behind him. A sense of missed opportunity deflated her spirits. She wished she'd asked more questions, or at least offered a welcoming smile that invited him to stay longer. But something in Will's eyes suggested he might not yet be ready for real conversation. Linda ambled over, noticing Grace's distracted expression. "That the same cowboy from the other day, the one who helped you when you fell?" Grace nodded, sliding the old maps into a protective folder. "He's quiet, polite, and interested in Steinbeck and local geography. Beyond that, I have no idea, but he seems genuine." Linda raised a knowing eyebrow. "Maybe you'll learn more next time." Grace hoped so. Yet as she glanced back at the door, she couldn't help feeling that, once again, she'd let a fleeting connection slip through her fingers. The hush left in his wake tugged at her heart, reminding her that sometimes the greatest mysteries begin with a single, unspoken question. The following evening, after another long day at the library, Grace found herself lingering at the front desk. The building was almost empty, save for Linda, who worked late shifts twice a week. The hum of the overhead fluorescents matched Grace's pensive mood. She placed a few returned books onto a cart, her mind drifting toward half-forgotten memories of her younger self, times when her world felt open and uncharted. Linda noticed Grace's distant expression. "You've been zoning out a lot lately," she said softly. "Something on your mind?" Grace hesitated, then mustered a small smile. "I was thinking about how my life turned out, or didn't turn out, if you know what I mean. I used to dream about seeing more of the world. Now I spend my days in these same four walls, worrying about budgets and overdue fines." Linda offered a compassionate gaze. "You do important work, Grace. The library matters." She paused. "But it's okay to admit you want more." Grace drew a deep breath. Memories of a broken engagement flickered, a ring returned, a box of letters tucked away in her attic, and the sting of feeling inadequate. That had been 3 years ago, and she still felt the twinge of betrayal at times. Her ex-fiancé had claimed she wasn't ambitious enough, that she was too comfortable in a small-town life. Now she wondered if he'd been partly right, or if she was simply too afraid to risk her heart again. Changing the subject, Grace tossed a glance at the sagging ceiling tiles and the flickering light in the far corner. "Mr. Beckman from the county office was here earlier," she mentioned. "He's worried about safety codes, says if we don't fix some of these issues, we might have to close for a while." Linda grimaced. "With what money?" "We're barely scraping by." A shiver ran through Grace. She couldn't bear the thought of losing the library. For all its chipped paint and squeaky floors, it was the town's intellectual heartbeat. Over the years, she had poured her passion into helping patrons discover new worlds through literature, hoping she might find her own spark of inspiration along the way. Linda spoke gently. "We'll figure something out. Maybe we can contact some donors, hold a fundraiser. Something creative. Cedar Hills can pull together when it needs to." Grace nodded, though her shoulders felt heavier. She walked to the back office, rummaging through old files, scanning budget statements, and noting down potential grants. Her eyes blurred with exhaustion. Outside, dusk had settled, painting the sky in purples and oranges. The hum of distant traffic lulled in the background. In a quiet moment, she recalled how Will had asked about the library's older collections, then about maps. Why was he so interested in surveying data? Possibly he was scouting land to purchase, or maybe he just liked history. Each guess made her pulse quicken, but she quickly dismissed the thought. It wasn't her place to dig. Yet something about him persisted in her mind, the way he had extended his hand so gently when she fell, or how he'd quietly listened to her instructions about the archives. She sensed a kindred spirit, a man holding unspoken regrets or a haunting sadness. Maybe he was just passing through like a tumbleweed, but her heart had begun hoping for more. She sighed, returning to the main room, where Linda tidied up a display of romance novels. "Long day," Linda murmured. Grace gathered her things. A lock-up. Outside, the air had cooled, the horizon steeped in fading twilight. Grace's car was parked near a single street lamp, flickering with a tired glow. She couldn't help but think about the places she'd never been and the life she might have led. As she fumbled for her keys, a wave of longing swept over her, longing for a sense of possibility, or maybe a chance to break free from her self-imposed limitations. In the distance, the faint sound of hoofbeats drifted on the wind, or perhaps it was just her imagination. She stood still for a moment, heart brimming with questions she couldn't quite articulate. Then she got into her car, headlights slicing through the dark, and drove away, feeling the weight of the past, but also the barest spark of something new. Saturday dawned with a crisp clarity that felt almost symbolic. Determined to shake off the malaise of the previous evening, Grace arrived at the library early. She moved through the aisles, straightening books and adjusting displays, trying to instill a sense of order that would calm her restless thoughts. If the library was faltering financially, at least it would look presentable. An hour later, Linda rushed in, cheeks flushed. "There's a farmer's market today down by the old train station," she explained excitedly. "I'm going to set up a small table with flyers about our library fundraiser idea. Maybe we can start planting the seed." Grace's spirits lifted a fraction. "That's a good plan. I'll join you for a while. Maybe talk to people about donating used books or coming to a potential event." Despite her lingering worries, she couldn't deny that the prospect of doing something felt better than resigning herself to gloom. They spent the morning at the makeshift booth, collecting signatures of locals interested in supporting the library. A few older farmers offered to donate produce for any future event. A few shop owners said they'd contribute small prizes for a raffle. It was modest, but it was a start. By noon, Grace was exhausted, yet oddly optimistic. The community, it seemed, cared more than she sometimes realized. As she rolled up a poster, she glimpsed a tall figure near the edge of the crowd. Her pulse quickened when she recognized the wide-brimmed hat. Will stood by a truck vendor, holding a paper cup of coffee. The moment his eyes met hers, he dipped his head in greeting. Grace excused herself from Linda and walked over with hesitant steps. "Hi, Will." She tried not to let her nerves show. "Didn't expect to see you here." He offered a small smile, nodding at the bustling market. "I like these local gatherings. Good way to learn about the town." Then he motioned to her flyer. "Looks like you're doing something important." "We're trying," she said, handing him one of the leaflets. "We're hoping to raise funds for the library. It's in pretty bad shape. If we don't find a way soon, the county might shut us down for repairs we can't afford." Will glanced at the leaflet, his expression thoughtful. "Libraries matter," he said softly. "They keep stories alive. That's worth saving." Encouraged by his sentiment, Grace found herself confiding more than she intended. I can't bear to think of Cedar Hills losing its library. People here deserve a place to discover books, ideas, a sense of community. It's my job to make sure it doesn't slip away." He nodded, taking that in. Then, almost shyly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded envelope. "I'd like to help," he murmured, handing it to her. "Might not be much, but every bit counts." Startled by the gesture, Grace opened the envelope just enough to see a check. She didn't read the amount, but sensed it was more than she'd expected from a passing acquaintance. Immediately, she felt a mix of gratitude and guilt. She barely knew him. Why would he be so generous? "You don't have to do this," she began, unsure how to interpret his motives. He shook his head. "I want to." Before she could protest further, Will glanced around at the busy crowd and mumbled, "I'll see you back at the library sometime." Then he strode away, leaving Grace holding an envelope that felt heavier than its actual weight. Later, as she rejoined Linda, her mind buzzed with questions. She couldn't deny the hope beginning to flicker. Maybe, just maybe, this was the spark she'd been craving. Accepting help didn't mean she was weak. It meant there were people willing to stand with her. And perhaps, in ways she couldn't yet fathom, Will would be one of those people. That evening, back home, Grace sat at her kitchen table, the envelope before her. She debated whether to deposit the check. Something inside urged her to accept it as a gift, a chance to move forward. She closed her eyes, letting that spark of possibility kindle in her heart. already sensing that her life was taking a turn she never expected. Grace ran her fingertips across the library's circulation desk, pondering the next steps for their proposed fundraiser. The air felt heavier than usual, the weight of uncertainty pressing on her. Although Will's check had given them a small cushion, the larger problem loomed: how to secure lasting support for a library that desperately needed structural repairs. Linda was off running errands that morning, so Grace found herself alone near the reading area when Margaret O'Connor entered. 65 years old, with short grey curls framing her warm smile, Margaret had been a beloved English teacher in Cedar Hills for decades. The townspeople jokingly called her the walking encyclopedia, and she wore that title proudly. "Grace, I brought you some of my old poetry anthologies," Margaret announced, setting a cloth bag onto a nearby table. "They've been collecting dust at home, and I thought the library might find them useful for your fundraiser or maybe to expand the collection." Touched by the gesture, Grace inspected the cloth bag. "Thank you, Margaret. This means a lot. We're trying to gather anything that can attract attention to the fundraiser and maybe give people something special to bid on if we do a silent auction." Margaret nodded, her gaze traveling over the shelves of worn spines and aging reference books. "I've seen this place through many ups and downs," she said gently. "I remember a time when the library was the center of everything, especially for kids who needed a bit of escape." Her eyes glimmered with nostalgia. "We can't lose that." Grace exhaled, sitting on the edge of a wooden chair. "Exactly. I just wish I knew where to find the help we need. We've tried local businesses, and we're planning the event, but the funds we collect might still fall short." Margaret pulled another chair close, settling herself across from Grace. "The world is bigger than Cedar Hills, dear," she reminded her in a patient tone. "We can reach out to organizations, philanthropic groups, maybe even people who moved away but still feel a connection to this town. Sometimes all it takes is the right story to unlock someone's generosity." Her words carried the air of mentorship, urging Grace to think beyond her usual confines. Grace fiddled with a pen in her hand, remembering how she'd once dreamed of writing grant proposals that brought in huge sums for community programs. That ambition had dimmed over time, overshadowed by everyday tasks and cautionary tales of small-town bureaucracy. "What if no one outside Cedar Hills cares?" Grace asked quietly, voicing the doubt gnawing at her. Margaret's brows lifted with a reassuring smile. "Someone always cares. You'd be surprised. Each book in this library was written by someone who cared enough to share a piece of themselves with the world." She leaned forward. "The question is, can you muster the courage to ask for help and believe you're worthy of receiving it?" Grace's heart squeezed at Margaret's words. She realized how reluctant she'd been to rely on others. But wasn't that the essence of a library? Connecting people with sources of knowledge, bridging gaps through shared stories and resources? She swallowed, nodding as if some invisible barrier had cracked. "We've also got new community supporters popping up," Margaret continued, tapping the cloth bag of anthologies for emphasis. "People are rallying around you, Grace. You're the face of this place, and they trust you to lead." They spent a good hour discussing potential contacts. Margaret remembered past students who'd gone on to successful careers elsewhere. Maybe a few of them would welcome the chance to give back. Grace jotted names and email addresses on a notepad, feeling her confidence grow with each suggestion. She resolved to draft letters requesting donations, endorsements, or sponsorships. Before leaving, Margaret gently patted Grace's shoulder. "Don't lose heart. The library needs you, but you also need the library. It's part of who you are, and I see how it lights a spark in you." Grace watched Margaret walk away, touched by her unwavering support. A mellow hush filled the reading room, but this time it felt comforting rather than oppressive. As she glanced around at the countless books and the gentle glow of morning sun across well-worn tables, she understood that she wasn't just fighting for a building. She was fighting for the hope and history contained within these walls, for the next generation's place to learn, dream, and discover. And in that realization, she found renewed determination. Grace stepped outside the library, notepad in hand, ready to approach local merchants about possible sponsorships. The mid-afternoon sun bathed Cedar Hills in a gentle warmth, but her insides trembled. She wasn't naturally inclined to ask for financial help, having always prided herself on self-reliance. Yet Margaret's words lingered in her mind, fueling her resolve. Her first stop was the diner on Main Street. Inside, the savory aroma of frying bacon mingled with the chatter of regulars. Mrs. Jenkins, the owner, greeted Grace with a bright smile. "Haven't seen you in a while, dear. What brings you here today?" Grace took a steadying breath. "I'm working on a fundraiser for the library, maybe a bake sale or a town fair. We're desperate to raise money for repairs. Any chance you'd sponsor us or donate some of your famous pies?" Mrs. Jenkins clapped her hands. "Of course! I'd be more than happy. How many pies do you think you'll need?" Grateful, Grace scribbled notes. That was one success. Next, she visited the local hardware store, the florist shop, and even the small antique store near the gas station. By the time she finished, her notepad brimmed with pledges, modest though they might be. Still, it was progress. People believed in the library's value. It gave her courage to push further. On her way back, she glimpsed a tall figure exiting the grocery store. Will. Her heart fluttered unexpectedly. He'd left such a quiet, generous impression that part of her longed to know him better. She could have turned the corner and pretended not to see him, but something nudged her forward. "Will," she called, stepping toward him with caution. He paused, groceries in hand, and offered a reserved nod. "Hey, Grace!" "Out collecting donations." She held up the notepad. "Yeah, it's going. Okay, actually, everyone's pitching in. We're planning a big event soon, maybe a book-themed fundraiser with music, raffles, anything that might draw a crowd." A flicker of warmth crossed his features. "That's good. You've done a lot since I last saw you at the market." His tone was friendly, but a hint of distance lingered. Grace hesitated, sensing he might slip away again if she didn't speak up. "We'd, love for you to be part of it," she said, trying to steady her voice. "Maybe come by, see what we're putting together. I'm sure your input could help. You know a lot about the region and, well, about books." Will lowered his gaze, as though considering. Then he gave a tight nod. "I'll see what I can do." The sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as they stood there, neither quite sure how to continue. Grace recalled how he'd quietly handed her that envelope, wishing she'd been able to offer a more direct thank you. His presence brought an odd mixture of comfort and curiosity. She wanted to ask about his life beyond Cedar Hills, but fear of prying held her back. Eventually, Will tucked his grocery bag under one arm. "I need to head out," he said gently, sounding almost regretful. "But I'm glad the fundraising's looking up. Let me know if you need anything else." Before she could respond, he gave a faint wave and strode off toward a truck parked a few spaces down, leaving Grace feeling both gratified by his willingness to help and frustrated by his continued reserve. Part of her wanted to reach out, to close the distance between them. Another part of her told her to give him space. He seemed like a man accustomed to solitude. She returned to the library, where Linda was cutting out bright letters for a new fundraiser poster. Grace dropped her notepad on the desk. "We have more people donating than I expected," she said, forcing a smile. "And Will might actually help in some way." "That cowboy's still in town," Linda teased, though her eyes sparkled with genuine interest. Grace merely nodded, grabbing scissors to assist with the posters. She couldn't shake the feeling she was crossing some threshold, leaving the safety of her old routines. A new path stretched before her, uncertain but invigorating. She didn't know if it led to deeper connection with Will or if it would secure the library's future, but she was determined to keep going, even if her steps were still a little hesitant. 2 days later, an unusual invitation pulled Grace from her usual library routine. Will appeared around closing time, wearing his familiar hat and an unreadable expression. "I thought maybe you'd like to see some of the land outside town," he said quietly. "I know you mentioned wanting to understand the region more for the fundraiser. There's a place I can show you." Though he didn't elaborate, Grace felt an instant surge of curiosity. She glanced at Linda, who nodded enthusiastically, shooing her away with a grin. After locking up, Grace followed Will to where a pickup truck was parked beneath a flickering street lamp. They drove south, past Cedar Hill's modest cluster of buildings, then veered onto a dirt road flanked by wide-open fields. The sky stretched endless above them, awash in late afternoon gold. Grace inhaled the scent of dust and prairie grass, excitement mingling with nerves. After several miles, Will parked near an old gate that opened onto a sweeping expanse of rolling land. He hopped out, letting Grace admire the view. A simple stable stood off to one side, and a few horses grazed peacefully beyond a fence. It was quiet. The only sounds the rustle of a mild breeze and the soft nicker of a nearby mare. Grace exhaled in awe. "Is this your ranch?" She wasn't sure what to call it, given his drifter-like demeanor. Yet the way he moved showed comfort, a familiarity with the soil and the horses. Will shrugged, leading her to the fence. "I don't own all of it, but I've been staying here a while, helping with upkeep." His eyes flicked to the horizon. "Wanted some space." She didn't miss the note of sadness that laced his words, as if that space was both a refuge and a reminder. She turned her gaze to the wide grasslands, trying to picture how someone could bear such solitude day after day. Maybe it was freeing, or maybe it felt like isolation. "Thank you for showing me," she said softly, and she meant it. The land was breathtaking, alive with possibilities, yet tinged with a quiet loneliness that reflected something in Will himself. He opened the fence gate, inviting her inside. "Come on. The stable's over there. I'll introduce you to Trooper." She followed, stepping carefully around the tall grass. Soon she was greeted by a sturdy bay horse with gentle eyes. Will ran a comforting hand along Trooper's flank, and then guided Grace to do the same. Laughter escaped her as she felt the horse's velvety muzzle nudging her palm. For an instant, all the tension in her life, the worry about the library, the frustration of not fully understanding Will, slipped away. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows. Will gestured to a small rise at the far end of the field. "We can walk up there. Best view of the valley." They strolled side by side, the air fragrant with sagebrush. Grace listened to the soft crunch of grass beneath their boots, waiting for Will to speak. Eventually, he told her a bit about his love for ranching life and reading Steinbeck, finding parallels between stories of the American West and his own search for meaning. He didn't divulge specifics about his past, no mention of family or how he ended up in Cedar Hills. Still, each sentence felt like a gift, a piece of the puzzle. At the top of the rise, the sunset spread in brilliant oranges and purples. The entire valley seemed to glow. Grace breathed in the spectacle, heart pounding with a strange blend of gratitude and yearning. She turned to Will, about to thank him for trusting her enough to bring her here, but found his gaze already fixed on her. A quiet warmth passed between them, something unspoken but vital. They lingered there until the evening chill crept in. On the way back, Will's silence conveyed a sense of contentment he seemed unaccustomed to sharing. Grace felt closer to him. even if she still had questions. As the truck rumbled back toward town, her heart overflowed with both wonder and the stirring sense that something deeper was unfolding, something that transcended the library's troubles and touched the fragile corners of her own longing for connection. When Linda suggested hosting a casual dinner to discuss fundraiser ideas, Grace agreed without hesitation. The problem was finding a space large enough for half a dozen enthusiastic townspeople. Linda volunteered her modest living room, explaining that her kids were with their father for the weekend, so there'd be enough elbow room. That evening, Grace arrived with a stack of freshly printed flyers about the fundraiser. She found Linda in the kitchen, stirring a pot of hearty chili. The scent of tomatoes and spices filled the air, mingling with the sound of friendly chatter from the next room. Margaret was there, sipping sweet tea and leafing through her old poetry books. Mr. Miller from the local hardware store was perched on the edge of the couch, offering ideas about setting up sturdy booths for the fundraiser. A couple of library volunteers huddled around the coffee table, brainstorming raffle prizes. The atmosphere was lively, energizing Grace with renewed hope. Then the door opened, and Will stepped inside, hat in hand. He hesitated briefly, as though uncertain he belonged. Grace felt her heart flutter. She hadn't expected him to come, but seeing him brought a subtle warmth to her cheeks. Linda waved him over with a welcoming grin. "Hey, Cowboy, make yourself at home. We're just tossing around ideas for how to make this fundraising event a success." Will nodded politely, stepping further in. He'd brought a pair of weathered boxes filled with books and a few old maps. "Figured the library might make use of these," he said, placing them on the table. "Some are duplicates from a ranch collection I've been helping sort." Gratitude lit Grace's face. "Thank you, that's incredibly generous," she murmured. She peeked inside the boxes, spotting classic Western novels, agricultural guides, and some intriguing historical atlases. These could sell well at a silent auction, or at least attract attention. As the discussions flowed, Will mostly listened, interjecting now and then with a quiet suggestion about layout or logistics. Grace noticed how his presence seemed to calm the room, grounding the chatter in a steady calm. It was a side of him she was starting to appreciate, thoughtful, understated, yet genuinely helpful. Midway through the evening, Linda ushered everyone to the dining table, a mismatched array of chairs squeezed around. They filled their plates with chili, cornbread, and salad. Grace ended up sitting next to Will, feeling a blend of comfort and nervousness. The conversation turned to rumors swirling around the library's issues. Some townspeople were still skeptical about the feasibility of raising enough money. "That's why we need to do this right," Linda insisted, handing around a basket of bread. "If we can't make a real impact, the county might just shutter the place indefinitely." Grace swallowed hard, pushing aside the anxiety that threatened to surface. She glanced at Will, wondering how much he was willing to step in, or if he preferred to keep his contributions anonymous. After all, he had already donated that check without much fanfare. Between bites of chili, Mr. Miller piped up, "So, Will, you planning on sticking around Cedar Hills a while, after the fundraiser?" Will's face remained neutral. "I'll be here a bit longer," he replied, dodging specifics. "I like it here, the quiet." Margaret beamed at him. "We're happy to have you, especially now that you've pitched in with these books. It means a lot." Will merely nodded, clearly unaccustomed to praise. But Grace caught the fleeting look of appreciation in his eyes. Somehow, he seemed just as invested in the library's fate as everyone else, maybe for reasons he wasn't ready to share. By the time the group dispersed, the sky outside was black with stars. Grace gathered her flyers and the boxes of donated books, thanking everyone for the productive brainstorming. As she reached the door, Will stood waiting, his hat in his hands. "Good luck with all this," he said quietly, gesturing toward the materials. She smiled softly, feeling the warmth of genuine camaraderie. "You'll be part of it too, I hope," she answered. "We can't do this alone." Will gave a small nod, and for a moment, a flicker of something close to a real smile crossed his face. Then he slipped out into the night as quietly as he'd arrived, leaving Grace's heart buoyed by the sense that they were becoming not just acquaintances, but allies, maybe even friends, on this unlikely path towards saving the library, and perhaps discovering something more profound along the way. Monday afternoon found Grace again in the hushed atmosphere of the library. A soft drizzle pattered against the windows, lending a cozy gloom to the normally bright reading areas. She was busy processing a new shipment of donated books when, to her surprise, Will walked in. He removed his hat, water droplets scattering on the doormat. Their eyes met across the quiet space. He offered her a gentle nod, stepping up to the desk where she worked. "I brought back Of Mice and Men," he said, placing it down carefully. The worn cover suggested he'd spent considerable time reading it. "I annotated some passages, if that's okay." "I can erase them if you prefer." Grace shook her head, curious. "I'd love to see your notes. Might give me insight into what stands out to you in a story like this." She gestured for him to follow her to the reference section, where they could sit at a small table without disturbing the other patrons. Once seated, they flipped through the dog-eared pages, discussing Steinbeck's exploration of friendship and dreams against the harsh realities of life. Gradually, the conversation shifted toward more personal terrain. Grace mentioned her fear of losing the library, how it sometimes felt like a reflection of her own life, small, undervalued, and precariously close to being forgotten. Will listened, his brow furrowed in empathy. "You're not small," he said softly. "You've done a lot for this place. You've found ways to keep it running, keep people reading. That's not insignificant." Warmth rose to Grace's cheeks. "Thank you," she murmured, fingers trailing along the book's edge. For a moment, she hesitated, then asked the question that had been circling in her mind for weeks. "You've been incredibly helpful, Will, and I'm grateful. But why do you care so much about this library?" He looked away, his gaze landing on a row of old dictionaries. "I guess I see the value in places where people can find themselves through books. I used to—" He paused, swallowing words before they could fully emerge. "I used to come to a library a lot. A long time ago. It meant something to me. It was a sanctuary when I needed one." The weight behind his confession stirred Grace's sympathy. She reached out, resting her hand lightly on his. "It still can be," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For you, or anyone who needs that quiet corner." He lifted his gaze, and their eyes locked in a silent moment of understanding. The rain continued its soft drumming, cocooning them in an intimate hush. Grace felt her heart pound as if some invisible barrier between them had finally cracked. Her guard slipped, allowing vulnerability to surface. "I don't want to push," she said, her voice trembling with sincerity, "but sometimes I feel like you're carrying something heavy. If you ever need a friend, or just someone to listen, I'm here." He inhaled slowly, almost as if he was about to release a confession. But then, footsteps approached from the front door, and they both tensed. A local mother and her 2 children entered, shaking off umbrellas, momentarily shattering the fragile intimacy. Will cleared his throat, pulling back his hand, and Grace retracted hers, cheeks warming. They parted ways in awkward politeness, Will promising to stop by again later in the week. Yet the lingering sense of connection weighed on Grace's mind. In that brief exchange, she felt the raw pull of emotions neither could articulate fully. She suspected Will wanted to trust her, but something held him back, a secret or a wound, perhaps rooted in memories that still caused him pain. As she resumed cataloging books, the children's laughter echoing in the background, Grace couldn't shake the tender vulnerability of that moment. Their conversation about Steinbeck had opened a door to something more profound, a glimpse into Will's soul and a reflection of her own yearning for connection. Despite the uncertainty and the hush that followed, she sensed that an unspoken promise had passed between them, a promise that, in time, might lead them both to an understanding they'd been too afraid to pursue until now. Days later, the library bustled with more patrons than usual. Word of the upcoming fundraiser was spreading, and curiosity about the mysterious silent partner who had donated a sizable check piqued local interest. A hush of speculation followed Will whenever he appeared, though most people barely caught more than a polite nod from him. On a bright Friday morning, Grace stood behind the circulation desk, scanning returned books. She wore a determined expression. There were still countless details to finalize before the big event. Linda was busy taping up a colorful poster near the entrance, reminding folks of the date and inviting them to donate or volunteer. Suddenly, Joe Cormack, a reporter from the county's small newspaper, strode in. He was around 39, slightly unkempt, and exuded the air of a man always on the hunt for a big scoop. Grace stiffened, sensing trouble. Joe had recently published an article speculating about the library's fundraising struggles and hinting that some wealthy individual was quietly keeping it afloat. His piece had stirred talk around Cedar Hills, fueling gossip that maybe the donor was more than a passing stranger. Joe tipped his hat in a mock greeting. "Morning, Miss Callahan," he said, voice bristling with forced politeness. "Heard there's a big push to save the library. Care to share the details for our readers?" Grace tried to maintain a professional air. "The fundraiser is open to everyone. We'll have auctions, raffles, and local entertainment. Any donations are greatly appreciated." "Is it true," Joe pressed, flipping open his notepad, "that a certain mysterious cowboy is bankrolling the event? Some say he handed over a large sum of money, others claim he's just some drifter. Any comment on who he is, where he comes from?" Grace's heart hammered. She'd promised Will discretion, respecting his privacy. "People from the community are donating time and resources," she answered, skirting the question. "We're grateful for all of them. Nobody's single-handedly bankrolling anything." Joe squinted, not satisfied. "Rumors suggest differently. I've been poking around, and folks say he's been seen reading old land surveys and referencing big property holdings. Care to confirm or deny that?" Her pulse quickened, anger flaring at his intrusive tone. "I have no comment on rumors, Joe," she replied firmly. "We're here to talk about the library's mission, not idle gossip." Sensing a story, Joe leaned over the counter. "Come on, Grace. The public loves a good rags to riches or riches to rags tale. If this guy's loaded, maybe he's planning to buy up the town or something like that. Cedar Hills deserves transparency." Before she could respond, Will himself stepped through the doorway, halting upon seeing Joe's inquisitive stare. Tension bristled in the air. Joe turned, eyes lighting up as if he'd discovered prey. "Well, speak of the devil," he drawled, striding toward Will. "Mind answering a few questions?" Will froze, his posture rigid. "I'm not interested in interviews," he said quietly, stepping around Joe toward the circulation desk. Grace shot him an apologetic glance, but she could sense the irritation coiling beneath his calm exterior. Joe followed, undeterred. "Word is, you've got more money than you let on. Maybe that's why you're sniffing around county records. Folks want to know if you're some kind of big-shot investor." Will set his jaw. "I'm just a man who likes to read," he replied, keeping his voice controlled. Grace jumped in, her tone icier than usual. "Joe, this is a library, not a press conference. Please respect our patrons' privacy." The reporter smirked, scribbling notes. "All right, I'll leave. But I warn you, Ms. Callahan, if there's a story here, I'm going to find it." He tipped his hat sarcastically and sauntered out. Silence weighted the room. Will's eyes flicked to Grace, an apology hidden in his gaze. She could feel the tension in him, the silent alarm of being cornered. Her heart ached at the thought that Joe might stir more rumors, possibly jeopardizing Will's carefully guarded anonymity. Grace gave Will a sympathetic nod. "I'm sorry about that," she murmured. "He's just hungry for a headline." Will exhaled slowly. "It's all right. I'll handle it. I just don't like attention." Their exchange felt charged, signifying a test of the trust forming between them. Grace wished she could shield him from prying eyes, but she also knew the truth had a way of surfacing sooner or later. As Will turned toward the stacks, she swallowed the uneasy sense that Joe's probing was only the beginning, and that whatever Will was hiding might come to light in a way neither of them was prepared to face. Morning light spilled into the library as Grace arranged a fresh stack of donated books on a long table near the entrance. The fundraiser was only days away, and anticipation buzzed through Cedar Hills. Thanks to local merchants, pies, crafts, and book bundles were piling up, each item tagged with a small card listing its starting bid. The scene gave Grace a sense of accomplishment, yet also fueled her anxiety. If they failed to raise enough to cover structural repairs, the library's closure might become inevitable. She tried to focus on the positive. At least the community was rallying, offering more help than she'd expected. A few out-of-town donors had even sent modest checks in response to letters and emails Grace had painstakingly composed, following Margaret's encouragement. There was genuine hope now, albeit fragile. The library door swung open. Linda entered with a bright smile, a stack of colorful flyers clutched under one arm. "I spoke to the local radio station," she said, breathless with excitement. "They agreed to announce the event on tomorrow's morning show. Might pull in folks from neighboring towns." Grace grinned, relief coursing through her. "That's fantastic. We need all the help we can get." Across the room, Margaret O'Connor stood at a small display of local history books, sorting through them thoughtfully. "I've also contacted a few of my old students who live in Denver now," she chimed in. "They might drive down for the fundraiser." More people, more donations. Between these updates and the sunlit morning, Grace felt buoyed by cautious optimism. Despite the uneasy memory of Joe Cormack's probing, she reminded herself that not everyone was out to invade Will's privacy. The town's newspaper might fan curiosity, but the library's supporters seemed more concerned with saving a vital community resource than prying into Will's life. Speaking of Will, Grace hadn't seen him in a couple of days. She wondered if Joe's confrontation had spooked him. A twinge of worry needled her. Will had contributed so much already. She feared he might retreat, unwilling to face more questions about his background. Yet part of her clung to the hope that he'd show up before the fundraiser. The event was, in some sense, born from his initial help, and the library's future felt entwined with the quiet generosity he'd shown. Around noon, Linda took over at the circulation desk, giving Grace a chance to slip outside for fresh air. She stepped onto the library's small porch, letting the mild autumn breeze brush against her cheeks. The sky above was a vivid blue, dotted with wispy clouds, an almost perfect day, yet she couldn't shake the faint flutter in her stomach, as though the future teetered on the edge of a knife. Her phone buzzed. She fished it from her pocket to see a text from an unknown number. "Heard the fundraiser's going well. If you need anything last minute, let me know. W." Grace's heart gave a leap. She typed a quick reply. "Thank you. We're finalizing details now. Maybe you can stop by. We'd love to see you." She hesitated, then added, "No pressure, though." Though his message was brief, it felt like a promise that he hadn't vanished. She tucked her phone away, remembering the comfort she'd felt on his ranch land, where time seemed to stretch and hush all her doubts. She also recalled the fragile look in his eyes when Joe cornered him. He had secrets, clearly, but they no longer felt threatening to her. Instead, his unspoken burdens prompted her compassion and, if she was honest, her affection. Stepping back inside, she found Linda glancing over the sign-up list for the raffle. "We might actually pull this off," Linda said, her voice brimming with anticipation. "Hard to believe we started with so little." Grace smiled. "I know. It feels like signs of hope everywhere. A bit of a miracle." In the quiet that followed, Grace felt a ripple of possibility. She still remembered the day she'd crashed her bike on the dusty road, how that single moment of unexpected kindness from a solitary cowboy had planted the seed for this renewed sense of purpose. Now, with the fundraiser looming, she sensed that everything, the library's survival, the future of Cedar Hills, and her own emotional awakening, balanced on an upcoming day that could either spark lasting change or confirm her greatest fears. Grace found Will in the far corner of the library, standing by the local history section as twilight dimmed the last traces of daylight. The building was nearly empty. Only the soft glow of desk lamps and overhead fluorescence lit his form, etched with a subdued tension she hadn't seen before. She approached quietly, sensing he wanted privacy but needing to check on him. "You've been away," she said, keeping her voice gentle. "Everything okay?" He turned, expression guarded. His eyes met hers for a moment, then flicked to the worn spines of the books around them. "I'm all right," he replied, though the strain in his voice suggested otherwise. "Just needed some time to think." Grace folded her arms, shifting her weight from foot to foot. "If this is about Joe's curiosity, don't worry. The library crowd has bigger things on their minds right now, like finalizing the event." She tried to sound reassuring, but a flicker of concern pressed in. Will, who was typically reserved, looked positively haunted. He cleared his throat. "It's not only that." Silence fell between them before he finally added, "A few years back I lost my brother. We were close." His jaw tightened, eyes fixed on a dusty row of Colorado land registries. "Afterward, I drifted, left behind everything that reminded me of him." Grace's heart panged with empathy. "I'm sorry," she whispered, stepping a bit closer. The confession explained something about the sorrow that always seemed to shadow him. "I didn't realize." Will nodded, exhaling slowly. "It's why I ended up traveling, working ranch to ranch, avoiding old acquaintances who tried to keep me in some mold. My brother's death changed everything, and it made me realize I wasn't sure who I was anymore." Grace wanted to reach for his hand, but she hesitated, unsure if he was ready for that comfort. Instead, she let her voice convey her warmth. "I understand loss. It may not be the same, but I've had my own regrets. Life in a small town can feel safe until you realize you're stuck." He studied her face. "You don't seem stuck. You're fighting for this library, trying to save something important." She offered a sad half smile. "I didn't always fight. I used to think my life was good enough, predictable, quiet, then everything started changing. The library's in crisis. You showed up, and I realized I do have a choice. Stay complacent or push forward. Honestly, I'm terrified of failing, but I can't just do nothing." Will looked away, seeming to wrestle with his own thoughts. "People here are good," he said, voice lower, "but if they found out certain things about me, I'm not sure how they'd react, or if it would cause trouble for you." Grace's curiosity piqued, but she remembered her promise not to pry. Whatever Will was hiding, beyond losing his brother, clearly weighed on him. Still, she had faith in the kindness of Cedar Hills. "You've been nothing but generous," she told him. "I doubt the town would turn on you if the whole story came out." His eyes darkened as though he wasn't so sure. "I can't lose what little peace I've found here. Cedar Hills feels real. Not like the places I left behind." Grace swallowed, a wave of compassion swelling in her. She longed to tell him that he didn't have to run anymore, that maybe, for once, he could stay. But just then, the front door jingled with a late patron returning a stack of borrowed novels, disrupting the fragile moment. Will set aside the dusty historical volume he'd been thumbing through. "I'd better go," he said, stepping away. She wanted to beg him to stay, to keep sharing. Instead, she whispered, "Thanks for telling me about your brother. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." He nodded without meeting her gaze. Moments later, he was gone, slipping back into the encroaching night. Grace stood rooted in place, feeling the library's familiar hush enclose her. Shadows of Will's past had flickered in his confession, but she sensed they were only part of the story, a deeper wound still concealed. With the fundraiser looming, Grace feared that what remained hidden might soon force its way into the light, testing both her heart and the fragile bond they'd been building. The morning headlines in the Cedar Hills Gazette hit like a thunderclap across the town. Grace arrived at the library to find a small crowd huddled by the entrance, copies of the paper in hand. Her heart pounded at the sight of Joe Cormack gleefully snapping photos with his phone. She snatched a paper from one of the onlookers. The front-page article read, "William Hartley III, local cowboy suspected of being wealthy heir." Her pulse went cold. The story outlined a rumor that the mysterious stranger, who'd been seen consulting land maps and making donations at the library, was none other than William Hartley III, rumored to be heir to large swaths of property in Colorado and beyond. Joe's piece dripped with sensationalism, speculating on why Will might be hiding his identity and whether he planned to buy local lands or transform Cedar Hills altogether. Eyes burning with anger, Grace forced her way through the door and confronted Joe. "How dare you print this without proof?" she snapped, voice trembling. Joe shrugged, a slick smile curling his lips. "It's news, Grace. People want to know what's going on in their backyard. If he's really a Hartley, it's a big story, and if he's not, well, maybe he'll come forward and deny it." Grace's stomach churned. She dreaded how Will would react. The library, already brimming with stress over the fundraiser, might become a circus of gossip. She glared at Joe, then turned her back on him, not trusting herself to speak without losing her temper. Inside, Linda found her, face pale. "It's all over town, Grace. People are asking questions. They're wondering if Will actually owns half the state." Margaret arrived moments later, equally upset. "The fundraiser's tomorrow, and now this. It's the worst possible timing. Everyone's gossiping about Will instead of focusing on saving the library." Grace's head spun. She recalled Will's apprehension about being discovered and how he'd told her that losing his brother had driven him away from his old life. If it was true that he was William Hartley III, then his real identity might explain both his wealth and his reluctance to share it. But now, the entire town was abuzz with rumors. She feared he might vanish, and with him, the vital support he'd brought. By noon, the tension was near breaking point. Grace fielded calls from curious residents, each wanting confirmation. She evaded their questions, refusing to speak for Will. Outside, a couple of reporters from nearby counties, likely tipped off by Joe, prowled the sidewalk, hoping to glimpse the reclusive heir. Finally, to Grace's dismay, Will appeared. He walked in with shoulders tense, face grim under the brim of his hat. A hush fell over the library as a few bystanders gawked. Not wanting a scene, Grace beckoned him to the back office. Inside the cramped space, Will paced like a caged animal. "I saw the paper," he muttered, voice seething with hurt and anger. "So much for anonymity." Grace closed the door, heart pounding. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I had no idea Joe would do this. Is it true? Are you William Hartley III? He removed his hat, frustration etched on his features. "Yes, My family's name is Hartley. We own significant land across counties and states. But after my brother died, I walked away from all of it. I couldn't shoulder the expectations, the constant eyes on me. I just wanted to live as myself, not an heir to a legacy I never asked for. The revelation ricocheted through Grace. She felt a flash of betrayal. He'd kept this from her, but also a rush of empathy for why he'd concealed it. "Why didn't you tell me?" Will raked a hand through his hair. "I didn't want the name overshadowing everything. I was trying to heal, to figure out if I could just be me." His gaze locked on hers. "And now it's out in the open. I'm sorry if this hurts you or the library." Emotion surged in Grace's chest. Confusion, anger, sorrow. "I wish you'd trusted me enough to be honest," she managed. "But I get it. I just don't know how we handle this. The fundraiser is tomorrow, and everyone's whipped into a frenzy." Will's expression darkened. "Maybe I should leave. Let the rumors die down." The thought panicked her. "No. Leaving now just confirms Joe's story, and the library needs you." She paused, voice trembling. I need you." For a tense moment, neither spoke. Then Will blew out a breath. "I'll stay for the fundraiser. After that, we'll see." Grace nodded, though her heart felt like it might shatter. She had prayed for a miracle to save the library, but she never imagined it would come wrapped in a secret this immense, or that it might threaten to destroy the fragile connection she and Will had begun to build. In the wake of the article's bombshell, Grace spiraled through a day of raw emotion. She should have been focusing on final details for the fundraiser, coordinating raffle items, checking the venue setup, confirming volunteers. Instead, she walked around in a fog, replaying her conversation with Will on a loop. His admission that he was William Hartley III kept colliding with her memory of the quiet, unassuming cowboy who had first helped her off the dusty road. By late afternoon, the tension in town had reached fever pitch. A few people whispered that Grace must have known Will's true identity all along, that she'd courted his favor for money to save the library. Others cast Will as a cunning millionaire bent on controlling Cedar Hills. The rumor mill ran wild, overshadowing the real purpose of the fundraiser. At the library, Linda hovered anxiously beside Grace. "You need to talk to him," she urged, voice subdued. "People are asking questions we can't answer. They're accusing you of scheming with him. It's crazy." Grace's chest tightened. "I tried talking to him, but he's avoiding me now. After we spoke yesterday, he left saying he'd come to the event but needed some space." She lowered her gaze. "I feel like I can't blame him for wanting to be alone." Linda sighed, looking at the half-finished posters and sign-up sheets scattered across a table. "The entire fundraiser is overshadowed by this gossip. If it weren't for the library's dire situation, I'd say postpone. But we can't. We have to see this through." Determined to salvage the day, Grace pushed her own heartache aside, throwing herself into tasks. She printed more flyers, organized donations, and directed volunteers. Yet despite her outward composure, inside she was unraveling. She missed the sense of closeness she'd felt with Will, that comforting presence that once filled her with hope. Now she questioned whether any of it had been real or just an illusion built on half-truths. By dusk, the library staff gathered to move supplies to the community hall, where the fundraiser would take place the next morning. Grace was taping up a banner when she overheard a couple of townspeople muttering near the entrance. "Did you hear he owns land from here to the state line? Maybe he'll buy the library out instead of saving it. Or just tear it down and build some fancy ranch." Grace clenched her jaw. She wanted to tell them how wrong they were, that Will cared deeply, that his reticence wasn't arrogance but pain. But every time she tried to speak, words failed her. If Will truly had the power to rescue the library outright, why had he settled for stealthy donations? Why not reveal who he was from the start? The swirling confusion made her head throb. That night, Grace closed up alone, exhaustion weighing on her. Rain tapped against the windows, mirroring her bleak mood. She stepped outside into the chill air, half hoping Will would materialize, like he once had, to offer solace. But he didn't appear. The darkness felt emptier than usual, and with each raindrop that soaked into her jacket, she sensed the quiet heartbreak sinking deeper. Back at her small home, she brewed tea to calm her nerves, then sat at her table, flipping through the Steinbeck novel Will had returned. She saw his annotations, thoughtful and precise, scribbled in the margins. A wave of sadness hit her. She recalled how gently he'd spoken about stories and the refuge libraries offered. That man was the same as William Hartley III, yet somehow the name changed everything. She pressed her palm against the page, tears blurring her vision. Maybe she'd been naive to believe she'd discovered an authentic connection. Memories of her broken engagement resurfaced, that old sting of feeling used or misled. She tried to remind herself that Will had never pretended to be poor. He just hadn't revealed the truth. But the sense of betrayal gnawed at her all the same. Setting the book aside, Grace blew out the lamp, staring into the shadows. Tomorrow's fundraiser would determine the library's fate, and possibly her own. The question of what came next with Will hung unspoken in the silence, a disillusioned ache lodging itself firmly in her chest. Dawn broke over Cedar Hills, casting long rays of sunlight across the streets. At the community hall, volunteers hustled to decorate tables, arrange raffle baskets, and organize silent auction items. There was a buzz of excitement, yet an undercurrent of tension ran just as strong. The rumor-laden drama surrounding Will's identity had certainly attracted more attention, but would it be beneficial or destructive? Grace arrived early, her stomach in knots. She'd hardly slept. Her dreams plagued by conflicting images of Will. One moment, the quiet cowboy who offered steady support. The next, an imposing air weighed down by unspoken obligations. Pausing in the doorway, she breathed in the swirl of coffee and cinnamon pastries donated by local bakers, reminding herself that the town still needed her leadership today. Whatever heartbreak she carried, it couldn't derail the event. Linda sidled up, pressing a clipboard into Grace's hands. "We're counting on you to kick things off. You ready?" Grace nodded, ignoring the flutter of nerves. "Let's do this." The morning crowd trickled in, bigger than she'd dared hope. People perused the tables, sampled baked goods, and chatted with neighbors. Margaret stood by a display of rare books, explaining their significance to a small gathering. Donations started rolling in, dropping into a large wooden box marked Library Fund. Despite the tension in the air, the community seemed to sense the urgency. The library's future was at stake. Then Will walked in, dressed simply, hat in hand. He cut a striking figure. Immediately, a hush spread. Whispers rippled through the hall. Grace's heart jerked in her chest as she watched him step forward, ignoring the curious stares. He made his way to the donation table, calmly writing a check. She saw Joe lurking at the edge of the room, camera ready, but to her relief, Will ignored him. After signing his check, Will lifted his gaze, eyes searching for Grace. She stood near the makeshift stage, mustering courage to face him. As he approached, the crowd edged back, granting them a pocket of space. The hush felt deafening. "How can I help?" he asked, voice steady but taut with emotion. Grace swallowed hard, momentarily overwhelmed. "We're about to start the opening remarks. You sure you're up for this? People will stare." He gave a curt nod. "Let them. I want to see this through." Drawing in a shaky breath, Grace stepped onto the small stage set up at the front. Linda handed her the microphone. She scanned the audience, residents, local press, a few out-of-towners, all curious about what she'd say. She forced a calm smile. "Thank you all for coming," she began, voice echoing across the hall. She explained the library's dire need for repairs, its vital role in the community, and how today's event could keep the doors open. "We appreciate every donation, large or small, because ultimately, this place belongs to all of us." A smattering of applause followed. As Grace continued outlining the schedule, she caught sight of Will, standing by the stage. His gaze remained fixed on her, and it filled her with a trembling sense of hope. When she finished, the crowd dispersed to explore the booths and auctions, leaving her momentarily free. She stepped down, and Will approached, overshadowed by the swirl of people. "I appreciate you being here," she said, eyes glinting with unshed tears. "You didn't have to." He inhaled, tension rippling across his shoulders. "I'm done hiding. If Joe wants to write about me, fine. I just wanted to help. That was the truth from the start." "I believe you," she whispered, remembering their rides through the dusty fields, his earnest questions about books, the vulnerability he shared in the library's stillness. A pang of sorrow remained for the secrets he'd kept, but a stronger emotion. Compassion welled up, urging her to move past the betrayal and see the man beneath it all. He hesitated, then added, "After this, I'd like to show you more of the land, my land, and maybe explain everything." His voice faltered. "If you'll let me." Grace felt her heart lurch. Across the bustling hall, curious eyes watched them, but she no longer cared. "Yes," she managed, voice thick with emotion. "I want that too." In that brief exchange, it felt like some small fracture began to mend. The road to true trust would be long, but standing side by side at the fundraiser, they both sensed that this day could mark the turning point. If they succeeded in saving the library, and if they found the courage to accept each other's truths, then maybe, just maybe, their battered hopes could be rebuilt into something lasting and real. The fundraiser reached its climax as midday gave way to late afternoon. A local band wrapped up their set, and a final rush of bidders crowded around the silent auction tables, scribbling last-minute offers. The air buzzed with hope, yet also crackled with underlying tension. Though the event had drawn a record number of visitors, everyone seemed equally fascinated by the rumor swirling around William Hartley III. A few onlookers kept glancing at Will, who stood near a refreshment table, shoulders taut beneath his denim jacket. Grace watched him from the small stage, where she was set to announce the closing of the silent auction. Her heart hammered, remembering his promise. After this, he'd show her his land, the place he truly called home, and reveal everything. But that vow felt precarious under the collective scrutiny of the crowd. She feared any sudden confrontation could shatter the fragile trust they were rebuilding. Taking the microphone, Grace thanked the volunteers and donors for making the day a success. She stumbled over a few words, nerves rattling her. Nonetheless, cheers and applause rolled through the hall. While Linda and Margaret gathered the final tally, Grace excused herself from the stage, heading toward Will. He looked up as she neared, the tension in his eyes softening a fraction. Before either could speak, however, Joe Cormack sidled in, notebook in hand. "Quite a turnout," Joe remarked with feigned cheer. "So, Will, if I can call you that, any comment on the success of this fundraiser, or your rumored holdings that might dwarf what's raised here today?" Will's jaw clenched. He took a measured breath. "I'm here because I care about this library," he said quietly. "It's not about overshadowing anyone or playing the hero." Joe's pen hovered over the page. "Come on, folks. The public deserves to hear why a man of your supposed resources wouldn't just write a big check and be done with it. Are you testing the town's reaction to your name, seeing if they'll roll out the red carpet?" Grace felt anger flare. She stepped closer. "That's enough, Joe. You're not here to support the library. You just want a sensational headline." A few heads nearby turned toward the confrontation. Will's gaze swept the room, landing on curious bystanders, then back on Joe. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he answered, "I didn't reveal who I was because it was never about the money. I lost my brother in a way that made me question everything. My family, our legacy, my place in the world. I came to Cedar Hills looking for peace, not publicity." A hush fell. Even Joe paused. Grace's heart twisted at the quiet anguish in Will's voice. His admission laid bare the raw sorrow he normally kept hidden. She stepped forward, ready to shield him from further interrogation. But Will lifted a hand, steadying her before she could speak. "I'm not denying my family's assets," he continued, turning to face the onlookers more fully. "But money can't mend a broken heart or wipe away regret. It doesn't erase grief." His voice wavered, compelling in its honesty. "Helping the library was something I believed in, not a publicity stunt, not a power move. I just wanted to do something good with my time here." An almost reverent silence followed. Grace saw faces in the crowd soften. People seemed to sense the truth behind his words. Joe, less moved, pressed on. "So, you're not looking to buy up the town?" Will's expression hardened. "I'm not here to bulldoze anyone's life. Cedar Hills has enough heart to stand on its own. I wanted to help preserve that heart, not take it over." With that, Will turned away, effectively ending the exchange. Joe stood there, pen still poised, realizing he'd lost the moment. Murmurs rose as some bystanders quietly applauded Will, or at least showed quiet respect for his candor. Grace felt a wave of relief and empathy flood her. His words, though forced out by confrontation, carried a raw sincerity. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with emotion, "for trusting everyone with the truth." He looked at her, eyes glistening with something close to gratitude. And in that moment, amidst the final swirl of bidding sheets and hushed conversations, Grace sensed that no matter how complicated his past or how vast his inheritance, Will's genuine heart shone through. The library fundraiser was ending, but their journey into the uncharted space of honesty and acceptance had just begun. Not an hour later, the fundraiser came to a close. Volunteers packed leftover items, and donors collected their auction winnings. Cedar Hills residents departed with cautious optimism, still abuzz from Will's unexpected disclosure. A handful approached him with handshakes, offering muted encouragement rather than condemnation. The tension in the air had eased, replaced by a fragile empathy. Grace helped Linda and Margaret count the money raised, their excitement mounting with every dollar tallied. Even with some checks not yet cleared, it looked like they'd surpassed their initial goal, enough to begin essential repairs on the library building. Relief coursed through Grace, though her emotions were a tangled mix of triumph, exhaustion, and a deeper awareness of the cost to Will's privacy. When the hall finally stood mostly empty, Will reappeared by Grace's side. She noticed how spent he looked, as if the day's honesty had drained him. "Ready to step outside?" he asked softly. "I think we could use some fresh air." She nodded. Together, they slipped out the back door, avoiding the last straggling reporters. A cool evening breeze brushed across their faces, carrying the scent of pine and dry grass. They walked until they reached a quiet spot near a line of oak trees, the warm glow of streetlights casting their intertwined shadows on the ground. For a moment, neither spoke. Grace stared up at the emerging stars, aware of how small they both seemed under that vast sky. At last, Will broke the silence. "I'm sorry, Grace. Sorry for the upheaval I caused." She turned to him, tears stinging her eyes. "You weren't trying to hurt anyone. You were grieving, searching for a simpler life. I understand now." His gaze dropped to a patch of moonlit grass. "That day I found you on the road. I was just passing through, trying to outrun memories. Then I saw you fall, and I don't know, something in me said, 'Stop.'" He paused, chest tight with emotion. It felt good to help someone without being William Hartley III, just a man doing a kind act. Grace recalled his gentle rescue, the dust swirling in the late afternoon sun. It felt like a lifetime ago. "I'm grateful you did," she murmured, "and for everything afterward." Will inhaled, bracing himself. "There's more I haven't told you about my brother, the inheritance, the family name. It's a heavy weight, and after he died, I blamed myself. I froze, couldn't face the estate, the responsibilities. That's when I left." Grace's hand found his arm, a comforting pressure. "You don't have to carry that alone anymore, not if you don't want to." Her voice trembled with sincerity. "I've been hiding my own fears too, afraid I wasn't enough, that I'd lose the library, that I'd never truly find love or purpose. But you helped me see that sometimes you have to risk hurt to find what matters." He lifted his eyes, a fragile blend of sorrow and hope there. "I'm not sure I can ever fully break free from the Hartley name. People will always have expectations or judgments. But maybe that doesn't mean I can't figure out my own path. Especially if there's someone I care about by my side." Her heart pounded, warmth radiating through her. This was deeper than any confession of identity. It was Will's admission of wanting to reclaim his life on his own terms. She closed the distance between them, letting her hands slip into his. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered, voice catching in her throat. The night enveloped them in a hush, broken only by distant crickets and the soft rustle of oak leaves. In that shared quiet, Grace sensed they were standing on the brink of something new. Wounds recognized could lead to healing if they had the courage to face them. "We should head back," Will said finally, though he made no move to release her hands. "You've got a library to repair after all." She gave a small, tremulous laugh. "And maybe you've got a ranch, or half the state, to look after." They exchanged wistful smiles, both aware that their separate worlds might merge in ways neither had imagined. In that tender moment, they chose to let hope guide them forward, acknowledging the pain that shaped them while daring to envision a future built on shared trust rather than haunted secrets. By the next morning, Cedar Hills awoke to the lingering buzz of success. Word spread that the fundraiser had raised a surprisingly large sum, enough for immediate library repairs and a start on broader improvements. Gratitude flowed like fresh spring water, and even the local radio station hailed Grace's efforts, calling her a pillar of the community. Normally, such attention would make her flush with embarrassment, but now she embraced the spotlight for the library's sake. Having wrapped up the last bits of event paperwork, Grace walked into the library to find Linda grinning ear to ear. The front windows were draped with cloth where cracks ran along the panes, a sign that work would begin soon. "We did it," Linda said, voice brimming with elation. "The roof repairs, the windows, the wiring, everything's finally going to get fixed, and it's all thanks to you." A smile curved Grace's lips, though she shook her head. "Not just me. Everyone stepped up. Margaret, you, the town, and, well, Will, too." Linda's eyes flickered knowingly. "Speaking of Will, are you two good now? Word around town is that he's staying, that maybe this wasn't just a passing visit." Grace's cheeks warmed. She couldn't help but recall the moment they shared beneath the oak trees, the quiet confessions and the tenderness in his voice. "We're figuring things out," she replied softly. "He's promised to show me the ranch, to be open about everything." Linda gave her a playful nudge. "You deserve happiness, Grace. It's about time." They spent the morning organizing books, clearing old boxes, and shifting furniture to ready the space for incoming construction. The library felt brighter already, as though the promise of transformation hung in the air. With every stack of old newspapers tossed, every leaky shelf replaced, Grace sensed a parallel renewal within herself. a readiness to welcome change, to see the world from a fresh perspective. That afternoon, Margaret stopped by, hobbling slightly on arthritic knees. "I hear we can keep the library open during repairs, as long as we don't block the aisles," she said, peering around at the reorganized shelves. "I never thought I'd see the day this old place got such a facelift," Grace chuckled, offering Margaret a seat near the front desk. "A facelift is exactly what it needs, and thanks to your enthusiasm, we've got more volunteers than I can manage. I'm going to assign them shifts so no one gets overwhelmed." Margaret smiled proudly. "I remember teaching you back in high school, Grace, your quiet determination, the way you'd stay after class to double-check details. This library couldn't be in better hands." Emotion tugged at Grace. She recalled days of teenaged uncertainty, how she'd hidden behind books to avoid heartbreak. Never had she imagined leading a town-wide effort or forging a bond with someone like Will, a man whose own heartbreak mirrored hers in unexpected ways. By late afternoon, she checked her phone, half expecting a message from Will. Nothing yet. A twinge of impatience nudged her. He'd said he wanted to show her his land. His land, she corrected herself, no longer just the borrowed plot outside town. She was anxious to see the full scope of his heritage. Maybe, if she understood his background, she could help him reconcile the weight of that legacy. As the library neared closing, Grace decided to swing by the local hardware store for some painting supplies. Stepping outside, she inhaled the crisp air, grateful for the library's stable footing at last. Then she noticed, across the street, a familiar tall figure in a wide-brimmed hat. Will lifted a hand in greeting, an unspoken invitation in his eyes. Warmth flooded her chest. She didn't hesitate. Crossing the street felt like crossing a threshold in her life. Once she reached him, he nodded toward his truck. "Thought we could take a drive, if you're free." "I'd like to show you something." A current of anticipation coursed through her. "I'm free," she said, her pulse fluttering. "Very free." He opened the passenger door, and she climbed in, heart pounding with a blend of excitement and trepidation. As they pulled away from the curb, Grace glanced back at the library, her anchor, now stable and about to be revitalized, then turned her focus on Will and the unexplored territory ahead. New looks, new horizons. With each passing mile, she felt the promise of what lay beyond the dusty roads, trusting that together they could transform not just a building, but their own wounded hearts as well. They drove deeper into the countryside, past the gentle slopes and ranches that defined Cedar Hills. Eventually, the dirt road climbed into higher terrain where the air felt clearer. Will turned off onto a private lane flanked by pine trees and wooden fencing. At the end of the lane stood a wide iron gate with a stylized H carved into it, an unmistakable nod to the Hartley name. Grace's breath caught. "Is this one of your family's ranches?" Will nodded, stopping the truck to unlock the gate. "Part of it," he replied. "My parents built this gate years ago when we were kids. My brother and I used to ride out here every summer. Now it's mostly looked after by caretakers while I wandered." Once inside, a vast stretch of rolling pasture opened before them. A large, rustic barn stood off to the left, its red paint faded by years of sun. Beyond it, the main house rose, 2 stories of weathered timber and stone. Though stately, it wasn't ostentatious, more like an ancestral homestead built to stand the test of time. Grace stepped out of the truck, the landscape unfolding in a breathtaking panorama. "It's beautiful," she breathed. The late afternoon sun cast everything in golden hues, illuminating the barn, the pond, and the gently swaying grasses. A few horses grazed lazily near a split-rail fence. Will came around, taking off his hat. "I haven't been back in a while," he admitted, voice tinged with both pride and sorrow. "Ever since my brother passed, I couldn't face it. Then I found this caretaker arrangement, paid them to keep things running, and left. But I realized something recently. Running away didn't make the pain vanish. It just kept me from ever healing. Grace reached for his hand, her touch a gentle reminder that he didn't have to shoulder it alone anymore. Together, they wandered past the barn, where dust motes floated in beams of fading sunlight. Will pointed out various stalls and tack rooms, explaining how his father used to breed horses there. She imagined him as a boy, carefree and laughing alongside his brother in these very fields. They approached the main house, pushing open a heavy wooden door that creaked with age. Inside, the living room spread out with a floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace, surrounded by antique furniture. A gallery of family photos lined a hallway wall, images of a younger Will, his brother, and their parents smiling on horseback or posed by fences. Each snapshot offered a glimpse of a life Grace had never seen. Will paused at one framed picture, pressing his lips together. It showed him and his brother, likely in their late teens, beaming at the camera, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, the bond between them evident. "Colt was only a year older," Will said softly, voice barely above a whisper. "He died in an accident, riding a horse we'd just bought. I was supposed to check the horse's temperament, but I was distracted. He took the first ride instead and never came back." Tears pricked Grace's eyes. Without speaking, she wrapped her arms around him. He stood rigid a moment, then relaxed into her embrace, letting out a trembling breath. His guilt, his regret, all the unspoken agony poured out in that single gesture. They remained like that in the hushed house for what felt like a long time, absorbing the echoes of a lost past. Eventually, Will pulled back, his eyes glistening with tears. He tried to blink away. "I've hated myself for so long," he murmured. "But I'm learning that maybe Colt's memory can live on if I keep this place alive, put it to good use, the way our family intended." Grace reached for his hand again, lacing her fingers through his. "You don't have to decide alone," she said quietly. "You have friends who care, a town that might benefit from your resources, and you have me if you'll have me." The sincerity of her words seemed to spark something in him. A faint, hopeful smile curved his lips. Light filtered in through the tall windows, illuminating them and the old photographs. In that moment, standing among ghosts of the past, they felt an almost tangible shift, as if something long shadowed had finally come into the light. Their confessions, their shared grief, and their tentative hope cast a new warmth into the spaces where heartbreak once lingered. They spent the next hour walking through the house and ranch, ideas brewing about how the property might serve the community. Grace suggested the possibility of hosting reading retreats, maybe a summer camp or historical tours that highlighted the region's ranching heritage. Each new notion seemed to fill Will with cautious excitement. He didn't have to let go of his inheritance. He could reshape it in a way that honored Colt's memory and his own desire for a simpler life. As twilight deepened, they returned to the broad porch overlooking the pastures. The sky glowed with pink and lavender streaks, while the ranch below settled into a hush. A couple of horses wandered toward the fence, as if sensing the day's calm conclusion. Will leaned on the porch railing, gaze sweeping across the land he'd long avoided. "Back in Cedar Hills, I could pretend I was nobody important," he said softly. "But there's no use running from who I am. Maybe the real trick is figuring out how to be William Hartley III on my own terms." Grace sat on the porch step, hugging her knees. "The library's taught me that having limited resources doesn't mean you have a limited life. But having too many resources can be its own burden. People expect something from you. They assume you can solve every problem." He looked at her thoughtfully. "Including your library problems. But the truth is, you solved those with the whole town. Sure, my donation helped, but you would have found another way, Grace. You always do." A warm flush swept her cheeks, a gentle pride she hadn't felt before. In that moment, she realized how much she'd grown, no longer content to be overshadowed by self-doubt or small-town constraints. Leading the fundraiser had awakened a dormant confidence, even as it had exposed vulnerabilities. Will's presence had been a catalyst, yet the real victory was as much hers as it was his. She rose and moved closer, slipping her hand into his. They stood side by side, absorbing the final colors streaking the sky. "We did it together," she said, voice quiet but certain. "But I don't want to lose that connection now that the library's safe." His eyes flickered with an unreadable emotion. "Neither do I." Then he exhaled. "I don't know what the future looks like, but I'd like you to be part of it." Heart pounding. Grace nodded. "I want that too." There was a vulnerability in her admission, echoes of the heartbreak she'd once endured. But overshadowing that old fear was a new conviction. She had found someone who understood brokenness, who had faced his own guilt and grief, and kept going. They lingered on the porch while dusk gently fell, and the first stars blinked into view. The mild evening air carried the scent of hay and distant pine. Beneath that starlit dome, words felt unnecessary. The hush they shared wasn't awkward or fearful. It was the shared peace of two souls, recognizing they had weathered the worst storms and emerged on the other side with hope intact. In the distance, a barn owl hooted, and somewhere farther out, a coyote's call echoed across the fields. Each sound felt like part of a grand symphony, orchestrating a new chapter in both their lives. Grace squeezed Will's hand, reflecting on how drastically her life had changed since that fateful bicycle accident on a dusty road. In that single moment, she had encountered a man who, like her, was quietly searching for more. At length, Will spoke again, his voice tender. "If we bring people here, like we talked about, maybe we could partner with the library, host events, writing workshops, reading retreats under the stars." Colt would have loved seeing this place filled with life. A tear pricked Grace's eye, one of gratitude rather than sorrow. "I'd love nothing more," she whispered, imagining future gatherings where people came to learn, to heal, and to connect with something bigger than themselves. The image was achingly beautiful, a testament to the journey she and Will had taken. In that moment, as the last of the sunlight disappeared behind the rolling hills, Grace understood that this was the true victory. More than raising funds, more than unveiling secrets, they had fought a battle against fear, grief, and the barriers that kept them locked in the past, and together they had won. The day after their heartfelt conversation at his family ranch, Will drove Grace back to Cedar Hills in a peaceful silence. The truck rumbled along the dusty road, the setting sun casting warm orange light across the horizon. Grace rested her hand on Will's arm, reflecting on the pledge they'd made, to rebuild their lives by honoring the past while embracing the future. In a single day, she had seen his greatest sorrow and his deepest hope, and somehow it made her feel more certain than ever that they belonged side by side. Back in town, life had returned to a semblance of normality. No throngs of reporters lingered, no prying stares followed their every step. News of Will's admission had stirred initial shock, but his honest words had diffused most lingering doubts. People realized he wasn't some power-hungry mogul. He was simply a man trying to heal and do good. Grace unlocked the library early the next morning, a gentle sense of peace settling over her. Construction crews had already begun working on the roof, their hammering echoing softly through the otherwise quiet building. She was grateful to see progress, piles of new wood, rolls of insulation, and fresh panes of glass awaited installation. Soon, the library would stand stronger than ever, a testament to the generosity of a community that refused to give up. Linda arrived, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and wearing a grin that stretched ear to ear. Construction foreman told me we're ahead of schedule, she announced, handing Grace one of the cups. The roof could be done next week, and the new wiring shortly after. No more flickering lights or leaky ceilings. A wave of relief coursed through Grace. That's the best news I've heard all morning. Taking a sip of coffee, she glanced around, noticing that even the stale library air felt fresher. Perhaps it was her imagination, but she believed the building itself breathed easier now that rescue was underway. Once the doors opened, patrons drifted in, navigating carefully around ladders and plastic sheeting. Margaret appeared mid-morning, hobbling gently on her arthritic knees, yet smiling as she browsed the updated catalogue. A few parents came with children, grateful the library remained open, even in its partial disarray. Every face Grace saw reminded her of how vital this place was. By lunchtime, Will quietly slipped inside. He wore his usual denim jacket but carried an aura of renewed confidence. He approached the circulation desk and gave Grace a small, private smile. "How's it going?" he asked, eyes flicking upward at the half-finished ceiling. "Better than expected," she replied, feeling a subtle thrill ripple through her at his presence. Want to take a look around?" They wandered through the aisles, stepping carefully over cords and rolled-up carpeting. Will paused at a table lined with historical volumes about Colorado. He brushed his fingers across the spines, lost in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I'm thinking about offering a donation of old Hartley family records. Could be valuable, historically speaking, for the library's local archives section." Grace felt her chest tighten with emotion. "You'd really trust us with that?" He nodded. "It's part of the region's story, and it feels right to share it. If we're building a future, let's include all the pieces of the past." She rested her hand on his arm, gratitude shining in her eyes. "You have no idea what that means to me. To this whole town." Before he could answer, Linda bustled over, brandishing a clipboard. "Hate to interrupt, but we need to confirm your presentation time for next week's community talk. Everyone's eager to hear you discuss the library's path forward." She flashed a knowing grin at Will. "And if Mr. Hartley wants to share a few words, the stage is always open." Will stiffened slightly, but Grace squeezed his hand. The tension in his shoulders eased. "I'll think about it," he murmured, "as long as no one expects a grand speech." Linda's grin widened. "We'll keep it informal, just you, Grace, and a grateful audience." With that, she headed off, clipboard in hand. Alone again, Grace turned to Will, her heart full. This was a new chapter for both the library and for them. No longer weighed down by secrecy, they could forge a meaningful path together. She saw the flicker of apprehension in his gaze. He might never be completely comfortable with the spotlight, but she also saw a quiet resolve. They had crossed a threshold into a life where fear didn't rule their choices. They lingered in that moment, surrounded by the soft hum of construction. Though there was no grand announcement, no crowd watching, Grace knew a profound transformation was underway. In the library once threatened with ruin, new foundations were being laid, and in the hearts of two people who had almost given up on love, hope was being reborn. A week later, final repairs on the library's roof finished 2 days ahead of schedule. With protective tarps now removed, sunlight poured through the renovated windows, illuminating shelves that sparkled like new. The musty scent of old water damage was replaced by fresh paint and the subtle warmth of promise. Grace couldn't help but smile as she walked the aisles, tracing her fingertips along the sturdy new support beams. That afternoon, Will kept his word and invited a small group, Grace, Linda, Margaret, and a couple of library volunteers, to visit another segment of the Hartley lands. He wanted to introduce them to possibilities for expanding local cultural programs beyond the library walls. Despite a few nervous glances, especially from Margaret, who jokingly feared she'd get lost, curiosity won out, and everyone piled into a pair of SUVs, following Will's truck down winding dirt roads. They arrived at an open meadow framed by towering aspens. In the distance, a modest cabin stood near a shallow stream. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. Dismounting, Grace felt the hush of nature envelop her, a peaceful contrast to the bustling library construction site. "This used to be my parents' favorite retreat," Will explained, stepping onto the soft grass. "We spent summers here, fishing in that creek. Colt and I camped under the stars more times than I can count." Margaret gazed around, nodding in silent appreciation. Linda, shading her eyes from the bright sun, asked, "You thinking about renting it out for events, camping trips?" Will paused. "Actually, I was hoping it could be a place for community workshops, writing seminars, maybe a reading camp for kids who want a taste of the outdoors. I keep imagining us tying it in with the library's mission." Eyes lit up all around. One of the volunteers, a middle-aged woman named Janine, clasped her hands together. "Oh, the kids would love that, and grown-ups too. A weekend reading retreat with nature walks, or an overnight camp for families. It could be magical." Grace's heart swelled. She strolled to Will's side, feeling the gentle crunch of grass underfoot. "I remember reading Steinbeck passages about the land shaping who we are. This space could do that, immerse people in stories and nature at once." Will glanced at her, eyes full of quiet pride. "Exactly. It would bring the library beyond its four walls, connecting folks with the wider world." They spent the afternoon brainstorming ideas, adapting the cabin for events, adding a few picnic tables, possibly building a small platform for storytellers or local bands. They took a leisurely walk around the meadow, Linda snapping photos to share with the library's board. Margaret rested on a large rock, head tilted toward the sky, remarking how the aspen's rustle reminded her of pages flipping in a treasured book. Eventually, as shadows lengthened, the group headed back toward the trucks. Grace lingered behind with Will, letting Linda drive Margaret and the volunteers ahead. She wanted just a moment alone in that tranquil meadow to breathe in the pine-scented air and let the hush of the land settle inside her. Will stood beside her, gazing at the golden light filtering through the aspens. "You know," he said, voice hushed with reflection, "this place was always freedom to me. No expectations, no pressure. I think I'd like it to become that again. But for everyone." Grace slipped her hand into his. "You're giving the town a real gift. Freedom is rare, especially these days." He turned his face toward her, wind ruffling his hair. "You gave me a gift too, reminding me I could still trust, still open up, and that maybe who I am isn't defined by a single name or tragedy." A tender smile touched her lips. "We all deserve that chance." They stood a while longer, watching the drifting clouds against a pale blue sky. Beneath those trees, Grace felt grounded and liberated at once. The library had found new life, and so had Will, and in truth, so had she. Where once she'd been content with a quiet existence, now she cherished something more, a shared vision of the future, stretching from the library's renovated shelves to the edges of these wild, open spaces. Together, they'd transform both pages and pastures into something that felt like home. As renovations progressed, the library began hosting informal gatherings to celebrate its rebirth. Grace and Linda organized a vision board event, inviting local residents to come, share coffee, and post handwritten notes about what they wanted the library to offer in the future. Book clubs, author visits, community classes, and more. The energy was infectious. Even the once cynical county inspector, Mr. Beckman, dropped by to praise the building's improved safety standards. Amid this whirlwind of possibilities, Will surprised Grace by suggesting they take the next step in uniting his land with the library's outreach goals. He offered to meet with the library board, officially. At first, the invitation made her nervous. Some on the board still remembered the initial gossip about his identity, but Grace trusted in Will's sincerity, and the board agreed to an evening meeting to hear him out. They gathered in the newly repaired reading room, where the lights no longer flickered, and the walls wore fresh coats of pale, calming color. Will stood at a small lectern, facing half a dozen board members, Linda and Margaret. Grace sat off to the side, heart fluttering like a proud friend, maybe more than a friend, though they'd yet to define themselves with any label. Will cleared his throat. "Thank you for letting me speak tonight. I'm William Hartley, but most of you know me as Will. I'd like to propose a partnership. The Hartley Ranch lands hosting educational and cultural programs in tandem with the library. We could sponsor weekend retreats, nature-based reading sessions, even local history seminars using primary documents from my family archives." A hush fell as the board members glanced at one another. Some nodded in cautious support, others tapped pens against their notepads, eyes narrowed with curiosity. One finally spoke up. "That's quite generous. What would you expect in return?" Will paused, glancing at Grace for reassurance. He took a breath. "Nothing, really. We'd have to work out logistics, maintenance, scheduling, but I'm not asking for money. If anything, I'd like to donate some of my resources so we can expand the library's reach, maybe even create scholarships for local kids to attend these programs without cost." The board's chairman, a gray-haired man named Leonard, leaned forward. "You understand this is a big undertaking, right? Liability, insurance, ongoing coordination. We'll need to ensure everything is above board." Will nodded, shoulders taut but eyes earnest. "I do. I'll cover any necessary legalities. My caretaker staff can help maintain facilities. I only ask that the library share its knowledge and passion, bringing visitors and local families out to the ranch." Grace watched the board exchange impressed looks. Margaret, unable to hold back her enthusiasm, clapped once. "I think it's wonderful," she declared, her gentle voice brimming with hope. "A true blend of reading, nature, and community ties. Colt—" She paused, looking at Will warmly. "Colt would be proud." Emotion flickered across Will's features. With a grateful nod, he stepped back from the lectern. The board members murmured among themselves. Leonard finally raised a hand. "Let's vote informally to move forward with planning. All in favor?" Every hand in the room went up. Relief whooshed through Grace. She turned to Will, who exhaled a breath he'd been holding. A soft, mutual smile passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that the seeds they'd planted were now taking root. Linda guided the group through a discussion of potential pilot programs, maybe a weekend poetry retreat or a children's reading camp next summer. Even the most practical-minded board members chimed in with ideas for marketing and community outreach. By the time the meeting ended, an air of excitement enveloped the library, as if they'd stumbled upon a treasure chest of possibilities. Later, Will waited while Grace locked up. The crisp night air greeted them outside, stars twinkling overhead. They walked side by side to his truck, the hum of street lamps a soothing backdrop. Grace felt a swell of anticipation for everything that lay ahead. Not just for the library, but for them personally. Two people who had started off as strangers on a dusty road, yet somehow found a shared dream. Stopping by the passenger door, she turned to him, heart thrumming. "This is really happening," she whispered, voice trembling with excitement. "You're making a difference, Will, in ways you can't even imagine." His eyes shone with humble gratitude. "So are you, Grace. I just found the courage to follow your lead." They smiled in the flickering lamplight, aware that something profound had taken shape. A dream they were building together, bridging land and literature, heartbreak and hope. And now, with both the library's foundation and their own connection growing stronger, they could finally see a future brimming with promise, one they were determined to share. Under a brilliant blue sky, Will saddled two gentle horses by the edge of Cedar Hill's outskirts. He'd invited Grace to revisit the place where they first truly connected, hoping to close a circle and open a new chapter. With the library repairs nearing completion and plans for ranch collaborations in motion, it felt like the right moment for an unhurried ride through the dusty roads that once changed both their paths. Grace arrived, cheeks flushed with a mixture of joy and nerves. She wore sturdy boots and a light jacket, her hair tied back to keep it from blowing across her face in the wind. Despite the progress they'd made, she still felt a flutter at the thought of exploring these open fields with him, revisiting the exact spot where he'd first appeared out of the swirling dust. Will handed her the reins of a calm bay mare. "Ready?" he asked, voice soft. She nodded, placing a foot in the stirrup. She'd grown more confident around horses since he'd shown her the ranch. Pulling herself up, she settled into the saddle, heart pounding as Will guided them onto the same winding dirt path she had once biked so routinely. Warm sunshine soaked the plain, highlighting the gentle roll of hills that stretched toward the horizon. They trotted at an easy pace, dust rising around the horses' hooves. Every now and then, Grace felt a surge of awe at the sheer simplicity of it all. How had her life changed so much from a single encounter? They dismounted at a bend in the road, where a battered fence lined a patch of low scrub brush. Grace recognized the spot immediately. "That's where the truck forced me off the road," she murmured, pointing at a faint tire mark in the dirt. She could almost see the ghost of her old self, sprawled on gravel, bruised knee aching. Will looped the reins around a fence post and approached the area. "I remember," he said, voice tight with emotion. "I saw you fall, and something in me said I couldn't just ride by. I was carrying so much grief, but somehow helping you felt like the first step back to living." Grace inhaled sharply, recalling the swirl of dust, his outstretched hand, and that fleeting look in his eyes, kindness layered over sorrow. "I was so shaken, yet you felt like the safest person in the world at that moment," she whispered. "I didn't even know your name, but I knew I could trust you." They stood there, letting the breeze blow gently across the fields. Then Grace took a step closer, her voice trembling with gratitude. "You know, it was after you helped me, and I said, 'Thank you,' that something sparked. Everything changed for me that day. My life, my heart, everything shifted." Will's gaze flickered, recalling the moment he'd first heard her quiet, heartfelt thanks. Softly, he repeated, "After she said thank you, I realized I couldn't just disappear again, and I didn't want to be alone in my grief anymore." He brushed a thumb across Grace's cheek, and she leaned into his hand. In that hush, the words of the title they were destined to fulfill finally resonated. What he did after she said thank you changed everything. Indeed, his choice to stay, to return to the library, to invest in Cedar Hills, those actions had set their story in motion. Grace swallowed the tightness in her throat. "That moment, Will, I still can't believe how a single thank you led us here, to rebuilding a library, bringing a ranch back to life, and finding each other. I'm so grateful." His eyes shone with equal parts affection and wonder. "Me too," he said simply, leaning in to press a gentle kiss to her temple. The dusty wind carried the faint sounds of birds calling overhead, as if nature itself bore witness to their quiet vow. Hand in hand, they stood in the same patch of gravel where a minor accident once altered their fates. The day's sun glowed on their shoulders, revealing how far they'd come. He was no longer just a lone drifter cowboy. She was no longer just a cautious librarian waiting for change. Together, they had chosen to embrace every messy, miraculous possibility life offered. Eventually, they mounted their horses again, following the winding road back toward the horizon. Each hoofbeat echoed the memory of that single moment. Two strangers colliding in a swirl of dust, a heartfelt thank you bridging their loneliness, and the steadfast belief that from life's simplest acts of kindness, entire worlds could bloom. And in the echo of that gratitude, a profound love had found its place in both their hearts, promising a future they would shape together. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.